So the theory argues that groups end up in conflict over resources. It's not irrational, it's rational that they end up in conflict. And in the face of conflict, groups change. Their relationship with their competitors become hostile, and they start to have these prejudicial attitudes and negative stereotypes about the groups that they're in competition with. And what one finds, according to the theory, is what's called ethnocentrism, which is enhanced loyalty to your own group. So the in-group is the group that you're part of, the out-group is the group that you're in competition with, and in the case of conflict over limited resources, we develop sort of more closeness to our own group, and we dislike and develop stereotypes about the other group. And so I want to tell you about a very famous and, to me, every time I talk about it, it's just fascinating study that was done to test realistic conflict theory. This was done by our friend Mustafa Sharif, who we remember from the autokinetic effect. And this was a huge study in the sense that he created a summer camp. He had an experimental summer camp, so it's huge in the sense that it took a long time. And it's just, I think, really a fascinating way of testing whether conflict between groups actually leads to prejudice and stereotypes. Sharif thought that if you randomly assign, in this case, kids at summer camp to groups and place those groups in conflict, you would get prejudice and you would get stereotypes. That conflict between the groups would be enough to lead to the negative attitudes and the negative beliefs. He also thought that the only way to reduce the prejudice and stereotypes would be you couldn't just eliminate the conflict and think that the prejudice and stereotypes would go away. Instead, you'd have to put the groups in a situation where they had no choice but to work together in order to achieve some goal, that would be the only way to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. You can see right away why this is sort of perfect product for an after-school special. And it does turn out that way, but we have to get through some difficult times to get to the end. So here's what Sharif did in the Robbers Cave experiment. It's called the Robbers Cave experiment because Sharif created a summer camp in Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. This was done in 1954. The camp lasted for 3 weeks. 20 11-year-old boys were selected to participate in this summer camp / experiment, and importantly, they were pre-tested such that, based on all the indication that could be derived from psychological testing, all 20 of these boys, totally normal, ordinary. They wanted to make sure that there was nobody who was overtly hostile or had behavioral problems. So all 20 of them were normal, ordinary, no extreme hostility, no behavioral problems. Sharif randomly assigned the boys into 2 separate groups. So that's, again, critical. They were randomly assigned to be in one or another group. And Sharif brought the boys to the camp separately and set them up sort of around the lake from each other so that they early on did not know that the other group existed. So for the first week or so, each group of 10 boys, randomly assigned to their group, they believed that they were alone in the summer camp in the park. During the first week, the groups had no contact with each other. They didn't know about each other. They did typical summer camp stuff like swimming and hiking, and they did other things that summer camp groups of boys would do. They came up with a name for themselves. One group called themselves the Rattlers, and the other group inevitably called themselves the Eagles. They also each developed sort of their own rules of behavior, their own leadership. Just for example, there was no influence on this, it just happened naturally. The Rattlers were like the tough guys, they cursed a lot. But the Eagles actually forbade cursing. Now they didn't know about each other, so they weren't responding to each other. It just shows you the variability in sort of how these things can turn out. At the end of the first week, the 2 groups were led by Sharif's sort of strategic planning to discover one another. like they both went to play baseball at the same place. They thought they were just gonna, they thought they were the only ones there, and then they discovered that this other group of 10 kids was also there, and that was a surprise. At that point, Sharif introduced the material conflict. So realistic conflict theory says that when you have two groups, they will develop prejudice and stereotypes towards each other if they are in conflict over limited material resources. Those of you who went to sleepaway camp can probably see where this is going. How do you put two groups of campers in conflict with one another to see if it leads to prejudice and stereotypes? Well, you create a tournament consisting of a series of athletic events. When I was in camp, you would call this a color war. I suspect that that's not called that anymore. But maybe it is. Is it? That's interesting. So the idea is, for those of you for whom this is not familiar, for those of you who want to revisit the pleasant or unpleasant summer camp memories of your youth, two teams, lots of competitions. Every time you win a competition, your team gets some points, and at the end of however long the competition goes on for, the team with the most overall points wins some prize. Now, there are some things, obviously there's individual competition, but you're competing on behalf of your group, so it's not like it's bad if you lose, but it's not like the whole team is going to tank because of your individual loss. So it's nice with collective effort. But it's a competition. Only one team is going to win. So here is the conflict. Only one, either the Rattlers or the Eagles can win the tournament. Both of them cannot win. Sharif thought that introducing the conflict would lead to prejudicial attitudes and to stereotype, and also perhaps to discriminatory behavior. And so he investigated how the groups changed once the conflict was introduced, and he did this in sort of some stealth, borderline creative and disturbing ways. That's sort of the theme for the rest of the study. It's borderline creative and disturbing. Okay, so first, the counselors made ratings about the leadership structure of the groups, and one thing that happened right away is that as soon as the tournament started and the conflict was introduced, both the Rattlers and Eagles sort of formalized their leadership structure. They became very clear about who's in charge of this, who's in charge of that. They measured the amount of prejudice and stereotyping in a couple of different ways. The counselors counted, I sort of imagine there was one of those counter things. They counted the number of names each group called the other. Like how many times did the Rattlers call the Eagles of pigs, and other things like that. They also had each of the boys make ratings about the other kids in their own group and the members of the other group. And they had to rate them on 6 traits. How does one do social psychological research with 11-year-olds at summer camp? Well, you have to be careful with your categories. So, the boys were asked for 6 different traits, whether all, most, some, a few, or none of the boys in their group and the boys in the other group fit each trait. So the traits were, how many of the boys in your group and the other group are brave,